Hi, welcome to the Vergas Show. I'm Sherry Hansen. Thank you for joining me in the new year. I'm here with Tom Thiessen. Thank you, Tom, for joining me.
Thank you, Sherry.
Tom, you know, I remember as a young girl growing up, we lived on one end of the Long Lake. And I remember my dad we'd look down the lake, and then my dad would always say, "That's Thiessen's Point out there."
And before it was Thiessen's Point, it was Peterson's Point.
Okay, and so I do know from that there's family history here in Vergas on Thiessen's Point, and I know that you have a summer home here, don't you?
Yes, we
yeah,
do.
That's wonderful. Well, I'm glad that you're part of the Vergas community. What we're going to talk about, though, is something that's way back in the Vergas community. And this is something I also remember my dad talking about. It's the Thiessen Pickle Factory. Now, explain that to me.
Well, that refers to a pickle brining station that was here, a salt station that existed along the railroad track between the downtown part of Vergas and the ball field.
You know, I think where the location actually is that people might recognize now is Paul's insulation plant is there.
It was very close to that.
Okay.
And it was also red in color like Paul's plant is.
Oh, that's fun.
And it was a cucumber brining station that was built in 1921 and operated through 1958.
Okay.
And in 1960, my dad sold the company and sold the business. And
did he sell it to a big name pickle person?
he sold some of it to the Gedney Company.
Gedney Company. I know you've got a lot of history, and we've got some of that's in the Vergas Centennial book, but when I was reading some of the history that you gave me, it seemed like Gedney's was always coveting the Thiessen pickles.
They were a competitor.
They were a competitor, and so okay, your dad sold in '58, but what happened in Vergas before that, when people would bring in the pickles?
Well, the salting station was where where farmers would bring their cucumbers and sell them to the company. They would be size graded into different sizes, and then they would be put into large outdoor wooden tanks, and salt water would be added to them, the brine,
okay,
and they would be left over the winter to ferment and become pickles. So
I think that's so interesting that they were over the winter, that these, you know, you and I visited a little bit about cucumbers, you said had some kind of bacteria.
Right, cucumber skin is covered with a certain kind of bacteria that causes the fermentation.
Okay.
So that as soon as the pickles were acquired by the company, then they were put into these brine tanks while they were still fresh and still covered with this bacteria.
Okay. And so they were fermented over the winter, and then what happened?
In the springtime, they were loaded on railroad tank cars and shipped down to the processing and bottling plant in Omaha.
Okay, now that's where your family grew up, right? Is in Omaha?
That's where Dad was from.
Your dad was from, and so your young days were in Omaha.
Yes, I grew up in Omaha.
In Omaha then too. And so they'd get down there, and then what would happen to these fermented cucumbers?
The pickling spices would be added to them, dill stems and garlic and horseradish or whatever other materials were added to give flavor to the pickles.
Okay.
And then they would be bottled down there and then shipped out to market.
Now, in reading some of the history too here, you did have the H. Thiessen Company pickle label, correct?
That's right.
And then, but then you also sold under some other labels.
That's right. That was called extra label business, and the two largest customers that I'm aware of under the extra label business was the Heinz Corporation bought pickles and then put their own label on the bottles, and also the Safeway grocery chain.
Okay.
In fact, Dad told me one time that the largest single order for pickles that he ever received was for 200 railroad cars of pickles from Heinz.
200 railroad cars?
Yeah.
Wow.
That's a lot of pickles.
That's a lot of pickles. Wow, and to think some of those came from Vergas, right? Yeah,
yes, that's right.
Yeah, that's
Absolutely.
pretty cool. Now, you said that Vergas was one of the stations, and there were other stations along the railroad.
Yes, there were several other stations, both here in Minnesota and also in northeastern Colorado.
Oh, okay.
Pickles require a particular climate to grow straight. They require warm days and cool nights.
Okay.
And so that explains why they weren't acquiring their cucumbers from Nebraska, because there the growing season days are too warm and too humid.
Sure. And so here, up in the northern area, they would get cool, and
That's
then I
right.
never knew that.
That's right. So the company obtained their cucumbers from west central Minnesota. And in the 1950s, when I was growing up, there were 5 of these brining stations operating. There was one at Vergas, which was the smallest one in terms of bushel capacity. I think it was 5,000 bushels. New York Mills, Sabika, Miltona, and Almora.
Okay, so just all down the line that they...
That's right.
How interesting is that? Now, those big pickle barrels, were they're like a wooden barrel?
A wooden vat.
A wooden vat,
You know,
okay.
6 or 8 or 10 feet across, I'm not sure.
Okay.
They were very big barrels, and I was a pretty small child.
Right,
So.
yeah. In reading some of your information here too, I read over in New York Mills once there was an unfortunate accident in one of the pickle barrels.
That's right. The man who was the local foreman and local manager for the company, unfortunately had either a stroke or a heart attack when he was working alone, and fell into one of the tanks.
And so you know, there was that you know, there was some danger with it too, that with all that. But so how many people do you think that they employed here in Vergas? Do you have any idea?
No, I don't.
Okay.
Probably no more than 4 or 5, I would guess,
At a time,
the
and
peak
then...
season, which would probably be when they were loading the railroad cars.
Okay. Thiessen Chow Chow, what would that have been?
Several people have asked me what chow chow was, and so I Googled on the internet
Okay,
and looked it up. And it's a relish made of different kinds of vegetables.
Okay.
And actually it's a relish that's found in many cultures around the globe, and with different recipes for it.
Okay.
So it's basically a vegetable relish.
Sure. So I imagine some of the pickles, of course, you know, were you know, just pickles, used for pickles, but there were seconds always, you know, ones that maybe weren't as straight or weren't as sized as you wanted, and that's what would maybe go into the chow chow. And
That's right. That would be used for the relishes that were made, and pickle slices.
Okay. And so your dad sold in '58. I have to believe that, you know, the process, the way that it was from the 20s to the '58, that's a dying thing. We're not seeing that anymore, are we?
I haven't seen a pickle salting station in, well, since these were taken down.
Okay. And then do you have any recollection working in the pickle factory?
No, I was too young.
You were too young at that time.
At the time that Dad sold the company, I would have been 14 or 15 years old.
Okay. And so then, but you remember seeing them being loaded onto the
Oh yes, yes, I remember.
the railroad cars.
I remember
and
being around the station and being inside the salting station here and seeing large piles of bagged up salt
Oh, sure.
that would be stored inside.
Now I noticed that the Thiessen Pickle Factory in Omaha has gotten onto the National Registry. That's pretty
right.
cool.
A couple of years ago it was put on the National Register of Historic Places, and a development company bought it recently with the intent to convert it to housing.
Okay, and so the building is still there,
The building
and
still
does it still have the
stands.
name on it and everything?
Actually, the name is still on it. It
That's
had
cool.
when it was a pickle factory, it had an open loading dock, and the name H. Thiessen Pickle Company was above the loading dock.
Okay.
It subsequently was used as a meat processing plant, and they covered the loading dock, so there's a roof there and a wall in front of it. But the current owners tell me the Thiessen sign is still there.
Yes. Well, Tom, our time's up for today, but you know, it's really neat to think of something going on here in Vergas back in those days, and I love looking at the pictures where the ball field was just starting to develop, and then there's that Thiessen Pickle Factory. I remember when we did the Centennial book talking about it, and so I appreciate your information, and just it's kind of nice to know that you got a little roots here in Vergas, right?
Yes, indeed. Thank
Yeah.
you, Sherry. I appreciate the
all right.
opportunity to share some family history.
Right, and anybody, if they run into you in the loon's nest, they sure can ask you more, right?
I'm sure.
That works out good. All right, thank you so much. You have a good day in Vergas.